So I'm going to be looking at the two cases and comparing them and make understanding why they're so important. And there's a lot to unpack, so I'm going to try and talk really, really fast and hopefully get through everything. So the first case is about Emmett Jamison R. O'Neill. And what he did wrong is a lot to do with equity and ignorance and intolerance. And so some of the things he did were anger based and seems alcohol related, and he was very mean and very cruel verbally to a lot of female staff and female students and students in general. So he was often heard calling certain women, female staff, feminazis. He would often give innuendos of sexuality. He threatened a student and staff using and then using sometimes violence. He also used intimidation and harassment of staff, certain phrases and things he said, like, I know where you live and I know where your family lives. He verbally attacked a teacher. He entered a teacher's classroom while there was a session and berated her regarding him not being a vegetarian, throwing a hat, saying that it's the kids, cats, and dogs in the hat. It was very unusual. And then on top of that, he actually was charged under the criminal code for uttering threats to cause serious bodily harm. And so under the section 264.11 of the criminal code. So a lot of stuff. And I chose this one because I find that with our push for equity and inclusion and diversity, this is so important that we understand equity and fair treatment of teachers and students, and that they are afforded an environment that's free of harassment for gender and sexuality. Um, so why is this significant to me as an Ontario teacher? Because of that push, because of making sure that we should model for our students equity and diversity and multiculturalism and everything to do with any sort of oppressed community. And specifically, what I think of nowadays is Trump. A lot of the teachers in America are constantly finding that it's difficult for them to tell students who are emulating the president's behavior for them to say to stop, because he's this ultimate role model, or should be, and teachers are having a difficult time of saying you shouldn't act like that, but he's the most important person in the country. So to understand that is the same thing kind of for teachers. I need to be a role model, and to have this person acting that way, it makes my job and the rest of my peers' job even more difficult to act that way when he is not acting professionally and understanding the care in his behavior. How does it relate to the course based on the decision? Um, so I think it hits all five of Shapiro's looks on the ethical framework, because one, care. He does not meet the individual needs of students by barging in and talking poorly of the staff and to students and certain female students. Um, not making positive relationships, not doing any of that. As far as justice goes, does not deal with the students fairly at all, and does not follow due process for protecting civil and human rights, not in the slightest. Critique. Um, he does not demonstrate sensitivity to inequities whatsoever. Complete opposite. As far as profession, that's like the major one. He is not being professional, not acting professional, and the student is not at the center of his decisions because all he cares about is vocalizing his opinion. And as far as the community, doesn't care about the community issues, because the equity and diversity is all our issues, the community's issues, and he's not caring whatsoever. So I think it hits all five, and I think it makes sense for him to he got 5 months suspension, and then after the suspension he was mandated to take a course to look at his viewpoints. And I think that's important to understand. I think one of the things that we mentioned from time to time, but and I often forget regarding any sort of judicial system, is rehabilitation. We should always have the idea that we're trying to get somebody back into the game. You don't want to send somebody to life in prison, for example, but because that's just removing them from society is such an extreme case. Like you want people to come back. You want them to improve. That's the ultimate goal to life. So as far as the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, you are afforded the right to personal security, and you have equality rights for all. So you don't have to hear about this stuff about feminazis and sexuality and gender, and you have the right to feel safe. And he's completely demolishing that. As far as the Child and Family Services Act, the only real one I could kind of push into is the right to care, and that the students have in a community setting, you have to suit their aptitudes and interests. And although your sexuality or gender is not an aptitude or an interest, you do have uh, to kind of keep that in mind, that like students have interest of having safety and a fun and learning environment, and him to barge into the classroom like that is not okay. Not thinking of them and how they're doing. Like they were doing silent reading for of all things, which is just so, it's such an abusive and abruptive way of coming in. As far as the OCT, what they stated in the case, there was a lot. So it was all under professional misconduct. He failed to maintain the standards of the profession. He released and disclosed information about a student to a person other than the student. He abused a student or students physically, sexually, verbally, psychologically, or emotionally. He failed to comply with the Act and the Education Act. Um, he contravened the law and the convention of which is relevant to the member's suitability to hold a certificate of qualification. He committed acts which, having regard to all of the circumstances, would reasonably be regarded by members as disgraceful, dishonorable, or unprofessional, and he engaged in conduct unbecoming of a member, and he displayed a lack of knowledge, skill, or judgment, and or disregard for the welfare of students of a nature or extent that demonstrates that the member is either unfit to carry out his professional responsibilities, or that the member's certificate should be made to subject to terms, conditions, or limitations. As far as the Education Act, I think it falls under 300.0.1. The purpose of this part include the following: to create schools in Ontario that are safe, inclusive, and accepting of all pupils, and to encourage positive school climate and prevent inappropriate behavior, including bullying, sexual assault, gender-based violence, and incidents based on homophobia, transphobia, or biphobia. Now, the next case, this one I found really interesting for me personally because it deals with EKO, and I know I had a rant on it, and I think it ties in nicely because this one, this one's a little bit difficult for me to unpack. So this one's about Annette Snow, who actually took, who was a principal at the time, and it was during EKO, and they had to administer the test, and she actually opened them beforehand, photocopied them, gave it to all the teachers for them to see, and then afterwards, during the test, she made comments to the teachers suggesting that they do what they could ensure to get good test scores, and the members took these comments as a direction to disregard EKO guidelines. And then during the tests, the principal wrote Annette Snow wrote an example of a story web on the blackboard and provided instructions to the students on how to answer specific questions on the test, and then assisted students by providing direction to them, which assistance was intended to ensure that their answers were correctly given. Now, why did I choose this? Because it's about EKO, and I have huge problems with the test, about the principal direction and how she chose to disobey the guidelines, and just about how the insubordination, especially with our discussion just recently of it, and whether or not you should be following the principle or should not be, and then the government involvement in that. This is their test. This is administered by the ministry, and the principal's insubordination of them. So, why is this? That's why I chose it. Why is this significant to me as a teacher? It's because there's always that fallacy of authority, right? The authority figure is doing something, so I should follow them. And although we have all these things in place to prevent corrupt power, and we should be following the orders of our superior, there's always, sometimes it comes to a battle of a decision of what is right as a teacher and what is insubordination, because you should be following the principle, but if you stand up against them, you are doing insubordination, and it's a battle between the two. And obviously, in this case, you should be picking like you should be going against the principal, but it still begs a couple of questions, which I'll answer later on. Um, Relation to the course based on the decision. So it's definitely profession for sure. Did not keep ethics of the test and the government and student at the center of decision. Like in essence, EKO is supposed to be regarding the students and understanding their achievements, and that's the test in itself has the students at the center of the decision. And you're going against the test, therefore you're going against the profession. Community. This is the test again is about student achievement and success for all, which is what community is about, and you're going against that. So that's where I think where the decision comes from. However, if we're going to talk about EQAO, you have to think about care and critique in that. So by going against the guidelines, you are not fulfilling the student needs, but it still begs the question about whether or not EKO itself ethically follows care because it does not meet individual student needs on the same front. And then critique, which is that it says encourages discourse of questioning the status quo. So is the principle, in essence, questioning the status quo of EQAO? Now, are they doing it in a proper way? No, definitely not. There are these guidelines. We follow the government. The principal, as a prior teacher and as a principal now, knew what they were doing. They knew what was going on, but it still begs the question afterwards about what are we doing with the test. The test is also problematic, but also on top of that, the decision was, and they even say it in the document, that it was a serious decision, and they gave them 10 months suspension and then had to follow up with a professional ethics course. And what I find truly astounding is that the previous case I just mentioned is 5 months, and this person went through like an entire tour of berating women and gets 5 months, and she just doesn't follow the guidelines of the test, which whether she wanted good grades because she wanted to look good or didn't want to have a struggling school is one thing. Whether she was thinking about the students, I don't know. I can't speculate. But for her just to not follow the guidelines and get 10 months, but this man is vocally and creating an unsafe space gets 5 months, I think to me that seems like a disconnect. And that's a huge thing. And that's another like reason why I find this one to be significant to me as a teacher, because I don't know, it just doesn't fit for me. As far as the Charter of Rights and Freedoms for this one, I think it's a right to liberty. You have to follow these rules. You have to follow. You're given the stewardship, and you have to follow them. And the principal did not do that. As far as the Child Family Services Act, it doesn't really apply. This was all dealt with how she presented the test. There's no real actual physical or any mental harm to the students. As far as the OCT, what they were saying in the document was that she failed to maintain the standards of the profession. Under professional misconduct, she failed to supervise adequately a person who was under her professional supervision, and she engaged in conduct unbecoming of a member, contrary to Ontario Regulation 19. So, as far as the Education Act, I think this falls under every board shall ensure effective stewardship of the board's resources, monitor and evaluate the effectiveness of policies developed by the board under Clause D in achieving the board's goals and the efficiency of the implementation of those policies. Because again, ministry document, we have to make sure that we're using them properly and administering them properly. Overall, I think it's still really interesting to me because one is about equity, and it's obvious, like these, you should be creating an equitable environment. That goes without saying. The EQAO one, EQAO has a lot of problems. I know it does. A lot of teachers agree, and we can debate whether or not it has care. It's obvious this principal did do something wrong, but it still should bring up questions about the validity of this test and the discomfort it gives to kids. And that to me is something that I think about a lot whenever I think about EKO. And so I found that second one to be a very interesting case, and it brings a lot to mind. So I found this all, when I was reflecting and looking at these cases, I found them really helpful for me.